give you an example. In 1961, President Kennedy said, in 10 years, we will have a man on the moon. Now, in 1961, we did not know how to put a man on the moon. Now, some ninny said, yes, but look, the president had NASA and the appropriations from Congress. I mean, how silly can you be? Did, in fact, the man on the moon start with NASA and appropriations from Congress, or did it start when Kennedy created the context of we shall have a man on the moon in 10 years? Obviously, with the context. Just because most of us ninnies heard about it after Kennedy had it all thought out, after he'd worked out the process within the context, doesn't mean that the context isn't what created the space for it. You see, you are sitting tonight at the birth of a context, not at the birth of the process which will actualize and manifest the context. You're in it at the scary part. You're in it at the part where most people can't function. There are no appropriations from Congress for the end of hunger and starvation on this planet. There is no national agency committed to the end of hunger and starvation on this planet. You are in on an idea's time coming where the idea's time coming is being caused. In 1961, Kennedy created, it's as if he created a building, analogous to a building, 4 walls and a ceiling and a floor. And the name of the building was, in 10 years, we'll have a man on the moon. That was the name of the building. When you walked in the front door in 1961, do you know what the first office in the place was? The first office inside the building of we'll have a man on the moon in 10 years was the office of it can't be done. You see, you take the position, the end of hunger and starvation on the planet, and all you do is to give rise to the opposition. Congress will never appropriate the money. People don't care about other people. The world stinks. Hunger and starvation are inevitable. Besides which, if anything could be done about it, it already would have been done. In any context, the opposing idea has the maximum amount of space. The most important idea in the context, we will have a man on the moon in 10 years, in the beginning, the most important idea was you can't do it. The pessimists, the cynics, they were in the front office because it was their position which needed to be ground into alignment. And what most people don't know about context is that context generates context generates process. Do you remember I showed you about forces in the world? You know when you try to change, watch. You know when you try to change the forces in the world, when you try to do something about them, what happens is that you wind up being consistent and in agreement with the very forces you're trying to change. That most of the people in the room have had a personal experience of you become that which you resist. And that the attempt to change the forces in the world only adds to the mass of those forces, to the power of those forces. And what we haven't noticed is that context doesn't change forces, it generates forces. It gives rise to process. And the context, we'll have a man on the moon in 2 decades, in 1 decade, ground up the office of it can't be done into actual material with which men were put on the moon. You know, and the next office was, well, you've got to have this kind of exotic metal, and that kind of exotic metal hasn't even been invented yet. Well, we know that that office got ground up into the exotic metal necessary to do the job. Oh, and then there was the big problem. Listen, this was the big problem. If you read the book on it, you find out that the really big problem was that we had to answer a very important question. And the important question was, are we going to get to the moon with very high-powered, low-technology rockets, or are we going to get to the moon with low-powered, high-technology rockets? And of course, the answer to that question spelled the difference between getting to the moon or not. You know what? It didn't make a damn bit of difference which way you answered the question. So all you had to do was to pose the question and answer it. The Russians have traveled in space with high-powered, low-technology rocketry. We've traveled in space with low-powered, high-technology rocketry. NASA could have answered the question both ways. Either way would have worked. Because in a context, what you do works. And you do what works. So then, you know, and all the way in the back of the bus, in the back of the building, were the optimists. And each year they went a little further forward. The day you sat at home and watched the guy step off the ladder, on that day the optimists were in the front office. But I want you to know something. The pessimists were as pessimistic as they ever were. The cynics were as cynical as they ever were. And their very pessimism and their very cynicism had contributed to the man who put his foot on the moon. Because within the context, all positions are allowed. And every position is now held within the space of the context. The Hunger Project is not some new solution to the problem of hunger and starvation. It is not doing more. Your crummy little sacrifice wouldn't do a damn thing to end hunger and starvation. It might make you feel better. It might be a humane thing to do. I'm not belittling it. But it's not going to end hunger and starvation on the planet. The Hunger Project is not about making a sacrifice. It is about causing the end of hunger and starvation on the planet within 2 decades to be an idea whose time has come. It is about transforming the end of hunger and starvation on the planet in 2 decades into a context for all of the ideas, all of the facts, all of the figures, all of the statistics, all of the attempts to solve the problem. That is the whole Hunger Project. It isn't more or less than that. It is the creation of the end of hunger and starvation on the planet in 2 decades as an idea whose time has come. It is the creation of the end of hunger and starvation on the planet in 2 decades as a context in which to hold hunger and starvation and the attempts to solve hunger and starvation. Then, in that context, what you do works. Because you have generated a condition in which the forces all go this way now, you see? So now, when you try to go like this, it goes like this. What's even better if you try to go like this? It goes like this. Quite a while back, I had a really wonderful meeting with a group of people at dinner in Honolulu, just at the very beginning of the Hunger Project. The man sitting on my left was a retired aerospace executive, very high-powered guy. In fact, he was such a great executive, he became a consultant. And now he was such a great consultant, he was retired. And he listened very politely. It was a nice dinner, you know, quiet dinner, reserved, so forth. You'll be pleased to know I did not embarrass you by breaking the reserve and quiet. However, he did. I mean, he listened to me for as long as he could stand it. And then he said, I hate people who think they're going to end hunger with words. What are you going to do? You got to do something to end hunger. Now, to kind of balance that for him so he didn't look silly, I stood up. And I said, absolutely, you are right. And I'd like to invite you to join the Hunger Project and be in charge of the question, what are we going to do? And he's been incredibly supportive, and I want you to know something. Really incredibly supportive. I mean, he's really very much a part of the project, very dedicated to it. I spoke to him when I was over in Honolulu. He's come up with a lot of good things, talked to a lot of people, gotten a lot of work done. And I want to be clear with you that that was not one up. In no way did I intend to be one up on that man. Because his annoyance and frustration came out of his very humanity. My intention was to give him a context in which, in fact, he could experience that he could make a difference. And that what he could do could have an impact. And that is the Hunger Project. It isn't any more or less than that. There are 4 generating principles in the Hunger Project. The first generating principle is the answer to a question that a very dear friend of mine has asked. The first generating principle of the Hunger Project is the answer to the question, what can the little individual do? You know, look. You know, what are you going to do, really? I mean, after all, if it were really going to be solved, wouldn't the government solve it? I mean, look, what are you going to do? You're going to make a $10 donation? You're going to go volunteer 4 hours a week? You're going to send a boxcar full of food someplace? See, if you're the United States Congress, you can make a $1.2 billion gesture. See, how about the giant organization make $100 million gestures? But nothing we do ends hunger and starvation. It persists. What can you do? You know, what can you do? What difference can you make? Well, I want to tell you, if you'll answer that question out of guilt, the answer is worthless. The Hunger Project is not based on guilt. Maybe you should feel guilty. I don't know. That's not the issue for me. The Hunger Project isn't based on guilt. It isn't based on feeling sorry for those people. That's dehumanizing, at least as far as I'm concerned. You're going to feel sorry for people who are starving to death, do it outside the Hunger Project. It's not about feeling sorry for people. And it's not about being ashamed. And it's not even about our selfish interest. Although I promise you it is in your selfish interest to see that the people around the world get fed. But that isn't the motivation here. The question, what can the little individual do, is a very powerful, incredible question to sit and ask yourself, to just be with for quite a long time. You sit and be with yourself and answer to the question, what can I do? And you will get in touch underneath your personality and underneath your act and your ego, and I call mine Werner. Underneath that is a genuine, natural, spontaneous sense of responsibility for our world. You don't need to be convinced. No kidding. That's bullshit. You don't need to be convinced. We don't need to make you guilty. We don't need to get tears streaming down your eyes about the suffering and horror in the world, and there's plenty of it, and it's worth crying about. If you and I just get in touch with ourselves, and it's very easy, because it's right under the surface. If you just get in touch with yourself, You will experience a natural and spontaneous sense of responsibility for the world in which you live. You will experience being responsible for hunger. And you won't have to add guilt or shame or blame or all that other nonsense to it. You will experience directly and for yourself a natural and spontaneous sense of responsibility for the end of hunger and starvation on the planet. So the first generating principle of the Hunger Project is that the Hunger Project is a project of individual and personal responsibility. It couldn't be anything else, and I'll tell you why. See, what you can do that no group can do, what you can do that no organization can do, what you can do that no corporation or institution can do, what you can do that no government can do, what you, the little individual, can do is you have the power that none of those other entities have. You have the power to create context within yourself. Context lives only within the self. You can make that capital S if you like, I don't care. The point is that the home of context, the source of context is self. What you can do that no organization or government can do is you can, within yourself, create the context, the end of hunger and starvation on the planet in 2 decades. Within yourself, you can cause the end of hunger and starvation to be an idea whose time has come. That's the power you've got that no other entity has. And that is the first principle, that is the first of the 4 generating principles of the Hunger Project. The second one is that it's not a movement. There's nothing to join. This is not a group movement. You don't join anything. It's not a bandwagon. There are no leaders. There are no leaders. I am here merely as the representative of the 15,000 people I've already spoken to, and in fact, I suggest I am here to represent you. We'll see when the evening's over. At any rate, there are no leaders. You see, nobody gets to take credit. It isn't that kind of a project. No one gets to take credit. This is a project. This is a project in which you and I have the opportunity to transform ourselves from just doing our part to being the source of it all. You have the opportunity in this project of realizing yourself as a whole instead of as some little part of something. In the Hunger Project, you are the source of the project. And you are the source of the project. That is to say, the project belongs to you, wholly to you. It's not that we join together, no. The project belongs to you, wholly and completely, and you own it in such a way that I can have the project completely and wholly as my own. And I have it wholly and completely as my own in such a way that it allows her to have it in a way that's wholly and completely her own. You know, if you take a photographic transparency and you project it on a screen, you get a picture. If you take a holographic transparency and you project it, you also get a picture. If you take the photographic transparency and you cut it in half and you project it, you get half a picture. Because that picture is made up of a lot of little parts, isn't it? But if you take a hologram, if you take a holographic transparency and cut it in half and project it, you get the whole picture. Why? Because if you cut a holographic transparency down to its smallest part, it is still whole. And they are analogous. Each of us is the whole project. In an alignment of wholes, as in a hologram, in an alignment of wholes, the image gets brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter, but each of it is whole. And that's the second principle in the Hunger Project. It is an alignment of wholes, not a mere sum of the parts. Agreement, movements, are a banding together of parts. You know, you do your part, he does his part, you do your part, you have to do your part. And really, listen, it doesn't matter if you do your part anyhow. You know, what the hell? It doesn't matter if you do your part. I mean, everybody knows that. It doesn't really make any difference whether you vote, does it really? You're one crummy little vote. I mean, you know that. Down in your heart, you know it doesn't make any difference. In order to get up and go vote, you got to pretend it makes a difference, but you know it doesn't make any difference. You know that what you would do about hunger and starvation wouldn't make any difference. Oh, if we could all band together, then we would have force and dominance. And we could send one of us out to lead us, and one of us out to speak for us. That isn't the Hunger Project. Agreement is a banding together of parts in support of a position or a point of view. Alignment is the spontaneous cooperation of wholes coming from a context or a common purpose. That's the second part. That's the second generating principle of the Hunger Project. An alignment of wholes, not a sum of the parts. You are the Hunger Project, or there isn't any Hunger Project for you. The third generating principle is the principle we've spent so much time talking about. I won't belabor it. It's the principle of causing the end of hunger and starvation on this planet in 2 decades to be an idea whose time has come. Hunger and starvation persist not as a function of what we do or don't do. Hunger and starvation on the planet persist as a function of the condition or set of forces in which we do what we do. An idea that is transformed from a content or a position to a context is an idea whose time has come. Now what we do works. Now we do what works. The fourth principle, and it won't be in the little booklet we're going to give you tonight. We're not ready for it just yet. But when you get to it, it won't be in it. I didn't know how to print it, but I want to tell it to you. It's the principle of transformation. 2 caterpillars talking together about flying think it's a joke. I mean, caterpillars are little fat green things that wiggle on the ground. They don't fly. See, at this end of a transformation, you cannot predict the outcome. People in interviews, when they finally get what it is, they say, well, yes, but when the idea comes, what's going to happen, Werner? I don't know what's going to happen. Thank God I don't know what's going to happen. I know miracles will happen. I know that caterpillars become butterflies. And I know that when you're a butterfly, you can look back and say, well, certainly caterpillar. All butterflies know that they were caterpillars. It's like you don't see any monkeys sitting around scratching their head saying, oh, someday we're going to be human. But you see a lot of humans standing around scratching their heads saying, I think we came from monkeys. You see, at this end, 20 years from now, we will look back and we will say, why, you dummy, certainly starvation and hunger ended. Obviously, because there were climactic changes, and suddenly the Congress appropriated, and then there was a NASA, and they invented the metal, and, you know, whatever it is. From here, we'll be able to look back and explain it in a nice linear progression. A billiard ball theory of reality. This ball hit that ball, which hit these 2 balls, and these 2 balls hit that. And very complex, but you can explain it. That's the problem with taking credit, by the way. Because up at this end, you can't get credit to save your hide. See, it's all explainable. So I warn you about taking credit at this end. What we need at this end is to know that miracles will happen. I tell you, miracles have already happened. This little silly hunger project, this little silly 15,000 people, that's about all. A couple of newspaper articles, a couple of television interviews, and 15,000 people. And I tell you, miracles have already happened. We'll tell you about some of them tonight. I mean, actual miracles have happened. Truly, no kidding, miracles. And I don't want to pretend that the Hunger Project caused any of them. I don't want the Hunger Project to take credit for any of them. I want the Hunger Project to be the space in which those things can happen. But I tell you that for me, the fourth principle of the Hunger Project is that miracles will happen. I am absolutely clear miracles will happen.